Hello, welcome to our session on healthy vegan and vegetarian Thanksgiving dishes. If you're interested in some ideas for vegan and vegetarian Thanksgiving dish options, or if you're thinking about creating an entire Thanksgiving meal that is vegan or vegetarian friendly, this video will offer some suggestions and some recipes. This can also be a good video for anyone who is serving a traditional Thanksgiving with turkey or other meat and is looking for some ideas about how to be more vegan or vegetarian friendly if there are people in your family who prefer or who have to eat a diet without meat or dairy or both. This video will cover two major topics. The first part of the video will discuss some things you'll want to think about as you plan and prepare vegan and vegetarian dishes for Thanksgiving. And then in the second part of the video, we will shift to some specific recipes and ideas related to the different parts of the meal, appetizers, main courses, and other side dishes for the main meal, and then dessert suggestions. So if you already know about substitutions and finding recipes that are vegan and vegetarian friendly, you could skip ahead to find our recipe suggestions in the second half of the video. Or if you aren't really looking for any specific recipe ideas, but would just like some general suggestions right now, you can just watch the first part and be done for now and come back to this video later. When you are preparing a meal that is feeding at least one or more vegans or vegetarians, there are some things you'll want to think about. First of all, the basics are that vegetarians don't eat meat or meat byproducts such as lard generally, but they may eat dairy. It may be that they only eat eggs, or they may eat eggs and cow's dairy. Vegans don't eat anything sourced from animals, or whether it's a meat or a dairy of some kind. So you'll want to pay attention to who you're feeding and what they can eat. And even some vegetarians don't eat cow's dairy because of allergies and sensitivities. And some vegans may not eat any meat or meat-related products because of particular allergies and sensitivities. So you'll want to ask why they eat what they do, and that'll become a bit more clear as we talk about some other things to think about. The main thing is just those guests who will be eating with you or your family members who live with you, ask them what they eat if you don't know already and what they can't eat, and then you can go from there. Once you have an idea of what you need to avoid, the main thing to think about is read your recipes and read your labels. If you have traditional dishes that you like to use, take a look at them and make sure that they don't have those ingredients that somebody at your table can't eat. If they do, either maybe look for a different recipe, find a substitution for that ingredient, or just omit the ingredient or serve it on the side. And we can talk a bit about some of the potential substitutions that you can think about for these traditional Thanksgiving dishes like mashed potatoes and other things. And one thing to particularly watch out for is a lot of recipes that even don't call for meat per se it'll be a vegetable-based dish, but then it calls for chicken broth. You can always substitute vegetable broth for those kinds of dishes and make it completely vegetarian and even vegan friendly if that was the only animal sourced ingredient in the dish. So pay attention, stock up on your veggie stock for the holidays if you're feeding a vegetarian or vegan. And you can have some other substitutions as well. There's vegan butter available, or you can just use oil or vegetable shortening. Do make sure it is a vegetable shortening, because there are shortenings that can have some animal byproducts like lard in them. So pay attention to that. Cheese, be careful, there is vegan cheese out there, but many of those cheeses that you find in the grocery store will say that they may contain traces of milk. So if you are in fact feeding somebody who cannot eat any dairy, you'll want to avoid those and maybe just have cheese on the side and not worry about feeding them any cheese if you can't find something that doesn't have a trace of dairy in it. If you're trying to cook something with eggs, you can use soy eggs or flax eggs. And there are plenty of plant-based milks out there. We use milk in quotation marks because it's not really milk, but they are fine substitutions. The one thing I would say is be careful because some of them have sugars added to them. The plant-based milks are definitely something you'll want to read the label on because there are sugars in some of them. They may say unsweetened right on the label underneath the kind of milk, like almond milk, or you may have to read the label. In this case, it does not say unsweetened underneath this oat milk, but then if you read the ingredients, there's no sugar added. So keep that in mind because many of the dishes that you would use these milks for, you don't want it to be sweetened. Even if it's a dessert you're making, the recipe assumes that the milk is not sweetened. So look for unsweetened plant-based milks if that's what you're using as a substitution for milk. We're talking already a little bit about labels. Some other things to think about are breads. Those can often have dairy in them, eggs and milk, but there are definitely vegan breads out there. I have recipes of my own for breads that only require yeast, flour, water, oil, and maybe a little salt and sugar potentially. So you can get vegan-friendly breads out there. You just have to read your ingredients or ask at the bakery. You can also get other things that are prepared this time of year already, and some of them you'll want to watch out for specifically. Instant mashed potatoes, for example, tend to have dairy in them. They might even have some meat broth in them. And canned baked beans can be an easy way to get some protein for your vegans and vegetarians, but watch out because some of them, Bush's Original, for example, have meat in them. They have bacon. So just make sure that you're reading that label. It's easy to find canned baked beans ready to go that just need heated up that are vegan or vegetarian friendly, but you do want to make sure you're not grabbing the wrong kind. And then anything else that you're getting that's prepared, just read those labels, right? Mayonnaise is something you'll want to watch out for because it's obviously made with eggs. So know that if you're serving anyone who is vegan. And then, as I said before, lard is an animal byproduct. So if you're feeding vegans and vegetarians, just assume that you should substitute something else. If they're vegetarian, you can probably use butter. If they are vegan, you'll want to use vegetable shortening, a vegan butter, or just some oil. And then another thing to think about is that if you're serving a traditional meal, it's really not enough to just have some vegetables and other plants that are suitable for your vegan and vegetarian members of your dinner to eat. You want to make sure they have a protein because meat is usually the main source of protein for anyone who eats it. So some other potential protein sources are listed here as options, and you can find dishes that include any one of these. And I've listed here in this table on the right some of the protein comparisons of a serving of meat versus a serving of eggs or cheese or beans, for example. You do get less protein in the plant-based and even the dairy sources than you do in the meats and seafoods, but serving something with a significant amount of these proteins is going to be very welcome by any vegetarians or vegans eating with you. This slide gives you some ideas of how much you might want to think about feeding an individual. So it's not enough, for example, to just have an egg or two in a dish if that's going to end up being a minimal amount of egg for someone to eat or that has a few beans in it. You'll want to make sure that each person you're serving who isn't eating meat is getting about the amount that is listed here on the right, about a half a cup of any of these plant-based proteins. And then for the vegetarians, it varies on the left side here depending on the source. So just pay attention to how much you're feeding them, and maybe then have several things that are available, or just make a large amount of something so that every vegetarian and vegan can get a half a cup of beans or lentils. And then one final thing to think about is flavor. Often we get flavor from the fats that are in the meats and dairies. A good example of this is mashed potatoes. My family, for example, makes a traditional meal, at least we have in the past, though we probably won't this year. And, you know, when we make our mashed potatoes, we rely on the butter and the milk, especially the butter, to give the mashed potatoes flavor. And then anyone who eats the gravy also relies on the gravy for flavor. But anyone who is not eating the gravy and who can't eat potatoes with dairy in them, you'll want to find something else to help give it flavor. So just make sure your recipes include something to offer some flavor enhancement. And I've got some of the main things to look for here on this list. You'll even find that if you're searching for vegan recipes, they may have these ingredients in them, and then that you'll understand why. It's because these are things that provide some flavor to these dishes that don't have the animal fats in them. And some of the recipes that we'll offer here today will do that as well, to give some flavor to these different kinds of plants, the fruits, the vegetables, the seeds and nuts and beans, all of those things. So now we're going to shift and think about some dishes that you might be able to serve. As I said at the beginning, we've got things laid out according to the different parts of the meal. Appetizers, if you serve those at your Thanksgiving, followed by main course dishes, and then finally desserts and how to think about those. Some potential options that are all actually vegan friendly, as long as they don't offer any potential trace of dairy, if that's an issue, when they're made in a factory or other site that also produces dairy and meat products. Hummus and veggies, nuts, any kind of bean dish or bean dip, as long as it doesn't have cheese in it, is vegan friendly. Or if it has cheese and you're serving vegetarians, that could be fine. Fresh fruit, obviously. And here we've got salsa, hummus, and guacamole, but there are plenty of other things that you can offer as dips to go with the vegetables that are vegan and vegetarian friendly. We might tend to think of those sour cream based and maybe mayonnaise based dips, but those won't be vegan friendly. So you'll want to find something else if you're serving vegans. And then something that might be served with appetizers or that might be served with the main course are some condiments. So gravy is obviously a no-no for vegetarians and vegans unless you have a vegan gravy. So that's an option, and we'll give you a recipe here that you could use if you're looking for one. I also have savory granola here, which you can find plenty of recipes for, and a vegan cheese sprinkle, which I'll give you a recipe for. These are things that you could serve with appetizers, or you can serve with main courses, and we'll talk about some of the possibilities with that here in a minute. So here is a vegan gravy option if you are going to make vegan mashed potatoes, for example. Or if you're going to make regular mashed potatoes with butter and milk because you have a vegetarian who will eat that, you could make this vegan gravy, and that would be something that the vegetarians can eat too instead of the meat-based gravy. You can make it ahead. You don't have to wait for that turkey juice. You can go ahead and make it a day or two ahead. It'll keep in the fridge for 3 to 4 days, or you could make some now and freeze it until Thanksgiving Day. It'll keep in the freezer for a while. And notice how it's got a number of those things on the list of flavorful ingredients. It's got plenty of them actually. Soy sauce, tamari, or liquid aminos. Anything fermented is going to enhance flavor. That's why vinegars as well as soy sauce are great additions to these dishes. They always enhance flavors. use your veggie broth, as I said, keep that around so you can use that instead of the meat broth, and then plenty of seasonings in this recipe too to give it some really nice flavor if you want to make it to put on top of vegetables, to put on top of mashed potatoes. We won't make this today, so you can take a screenshot of it or come back to it and look at the video again later if you'd like to make this recipe. It's fairly straightforward, so it doesn't require a lot of instruction. Another recipe that I just mentioned was vegan Parmesan flavored sprinkle. Something that is popular is the Parmesan encrusted veggies, right? Brussels sprouts are now in season locally. You can also get cauliflower and broccoli, and these are great veggies to roast for the holidays. Certainly they're vegan and vegetarian friendly, but once you put that Parmesan sprinkle on, your vegans won't be able to eat it. And if your vegetarians don't eat cow's dairy, that would be an issue too. So this is an option, this vegan Parmesan flavored sprinkle. The one on the left, version 1, requires a bit more work, because you need to have a food processor, blender, or seed and nut grinder that will properly crush the almonds and cashews so that they end up resembling coarse breadcrumbs. If you don't want to do that, or if you don't have the right equipment for it, version number 2 is super easy, and it is really flavorful still. It's not quite as thick like the breadcrumbs, but it's a perfectly great sprinkle. And when you look at it, you can really hardly tell the difference between that and a regular Parmesan. Of course, it's going to taste different, but the consistency doesn't look much different at first sight. This is some of the vegan Parmesan sprinkle made without the nuts. So it's just the nutritional yeast and the seasonings. And I've been eating it on salads. It's good on salads. It can also be put on roasted vegetables. It could be served on mashed potatoes if you don't want to worry about a vegan gravy. It'll add flavor to a lot of things. Nutritional yeast is something that you can find in the grocery store. Bob's Red Mill makes a nutritional yeast, and I got mine at the Broad Street Market. I buy it in bulk because I actually eat a little bit every day. A couple of teaspoons a day is supposed to be healthy for you, so I'll put it on my salads, or I will put it in my yogurt in the morning with some granola and fruit. It tastes it tastes similar to Parmesan cheese because it's actually, it's that fermented yeast flavor, right? And it's pretty good for you. And you can store it in the freezer in a sealed container until the next holiday. You could keep eating it every day if you want. It'll keep at room temperature for months. I made that vegan Parmesan sprinkle a couple of days ago, and I've been keeping it at room temperature and just putting it on my salads when I eat them. It adds a little bit of flavor, but also a little bit of nutrition. So that's something that you can do. You can use that instead of your traditional Parmesan sprinkle. You can do both and serve them both separately and just roast your vegetables if you're trying to feed people who do eat meat and dairy and people who don't. You can also just have some nutritional yeast there. You don't even need to mix this up if you don't want to. Nutritional yeast by itself is what I actually usually put on my salads. I don't even bother adding the garlic powder and onion powder and salt. So there are ways to offer some flavor, but if you have your own Parmesan sprinkle that you use for a recipe and you would like to substitute, you could just substitute nutritional yeast for that Parmesan too. There are a lot of options of what you can do with this, and they are all going to make what you're doing vegan friendly. There are plenty of other things you can do for appetizers. You can always check cookbooks. You can Google plenty of recipes online, but those are some things to think about as you maybe reframe your meal to feed vegans and vegetarians. Now we're going to talk about some main and side dishes for the main course. And a lot of these are going to offer a significant protein for your vegans and vegetarians. Here we have a picture of a salad that I made yesterday with both some vegan Parmesan sprinkle, and some savory granola. You don't have to do both, but you could. And there are plenty of savory granola recipes that you can find out there. So we've mentioned baked beans already. That's an option. You can just get a can as long as you make sure that there's no meat in the ingredients or meat sources like gravy. And then beans and rice, if your family eats those, are another option. You can throw those in the slow cooker. I'll share a recipe for baked tofu and one for a lentil bowl if you're looking for something different. Tempeh is another option. We're not going to do a tempeh recipe today, but there are recipes out there that'll even make like a tempeh bacon if you're interested in something like that. You won't want to crumble bacon on top of your food if you're feeding vegans and vegetarians, but you can do tempeh for them. And then any roasted veggies and mashed potatoes, as long as you are watching what the ingredients are, will work. We've talked about how to do a vegan Parmesan crusted roasted veggie dish, and I'll show you a mashed potato dish that is vegan here as well. Before we do the mashed potatoes though, baked tofu is another option. So here's a recipe if you'd like to do it. It takes about 25 minutes to bake at 375. So if you're baking a turkey, you can get this ready to go. And then once the turkey is out of the oven and standing, you can put this in the oven and bake it for about 25 minutes, and you'll toss it once halfway through. You can do it straight the way it is here, with or without extra seasonings added. I've added at times 5-spice seasoning or curry powder. You could add another spice blend that might complement the meal, or you can just do it without that extra tablespoon of seasoning. The soy sauce, tamari, or liquid aminos, because they're fermented, as well as the garlic, will help to give the tofu some flavor. If you decide to make this ahead, know that if you make it with cornstarch or flour, it's not going to be crispy like it is if you take it straight from the oven and serve it, but you can always reheat it later. You can make it a day ahead. Tofu will keep for several days in the fridge. You can freeze it too if you wanted to really make it ahead, or if you have some extra, that would be an option as well. This is another option that is probably especially helpful for anyone who is trying to go to a fully vegetarian or vegan Thanksgiving dinner. We are not going to talk about something like tofurkey here today. Honestly, I've never had tofurkey. I've never made it. So that's not something I'm an expert in. I tend to go for other dishes that have lentils and beans and things, and maybe tofu, but not tofurkey. So this is an option if you want to just make several protein type dishes instead of turkey. This can be made ahead as well. It's fairly straightforward, and it'll probably taste better after a day. I find that dishes like this always taste better after a day because the flavors have had a chance to come through a bit more. So you could serve this as a potential protein. I wouldn't necessarily call it the sole vegetable. You might want to serve a roasted vegetable along with it or something else, but this would go well with vegan mashed potatoes, or even vegetarian mashed potatoes with without the meat gravy, if you're serving vegetarians and are really going more for a vegetarian meal. And here's a recipe for vegan mashed potatoes. There are many things you can do with mashed potatoes, and there are many recipes you can find online. You could always use your own recipe, and then instead of the animal sourced products, you can substitute plant-based products like we talked about at the beginning. You can use the vegan butter or vegetable shortening or oil instead of regular butter. You can use a plant-based milk as long as it's an unsweetened variety, and then just make it according to your own recipe. This is a recipe that calls for you to start with plant-based products, and notice how it has some things to add some flavor to it. You wouldn't need to add the chives, scallions, or herbs if you are serving a vegan gravy along with it, or if you have the seasoned vegan Parmesan sprinkle. that will give some flavor to the potatoes instead if you wanted to do that. But if you wanted to just make some straight mashed potatoes and add a little bit of seasoning to it, the garlic and the the herbs will help. You could also saute some onion if you'd like and mix that in. I like that mixed in with my mashed potatoes too. All of that would give them some flavor. These are mashed potatoes made according to the recipe that I've shared here. So they're just potatoes, and I used a smaller amount since I'm only making enough for maybe today and tomorrow and not for a whole Thanksgiving meal. And then there's garlic, salt, and pepper, and I've used coconut oil. You can't taste that it's coconut oil. It's not sweet at all. And I just added it in when I mashed the potatoes. And they taste pretty creamy, even without any plant-based milk or actual cow's dairy to make them creamy. I'm going to add some spring onions to mine, but you could add whatever you'd like, any kind of herb, or you can serve it with some other topping like the vegan gravy or the Parmesan cheese sprinkle, whatever works for you. There are plenty of other main courses that you can do. Find those cookbooks again or check online if there are things that you specifically like and you want to try to find a vegetarian or vegan option for those kinds of dishes. What we're doing here today is trying to give you a few ideas and think about maybe some of those typical dishes that you would eat and how you can shift to making them vegetarian and vegan friendly. So the last category is desserts. And obviously, generally, any custardy kind of dessert is not going to be vegan friendly. If you have vegetarians who will eat any kind of dairy, then you're good to go. Just make sure that your pie crust doesn't have lard. You could substitute butter if you're trying to be vegetarian friendly. If you want to be vegan friendly, you'll want to make your pie crusts with either vegetable shortening or some oil. You can use coconut oil. That's a solid oil at room temperature, or you can use the vegetable shortening. And you can also just go baseless on a pie if you want to. You don't need to have that pie crust if you don't want to. You can buy those vegan pie crusts too in the grocery store if you don't want to make your own. So there are some options there. And then obviously fruit pies can very easily be vegetarian and vegan friendly as long as you're watching what you're putting into it. If it calls for butter and vegetarians eat butter, you're fine. If it calls for butter and you need to avoid regular dairy butter, then you can use a substitution like vegetable shortening or the vegan butter, or even just a little oil if you really do need that. I made this small peach crisp with no crust today and I made it very small with just one 13-ounce can of peaches because it's too close to the holiday and I didn't want to make too much, but I made it without the base. So it was super easy, and I would normally put butter in my peach or pie fillings, but I just skipped it. And this has molasses, peaches, cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and a little lemon juice, and then a little all-purpose gluten-free baking flour, but you could use regular flour too. And then I will give you a recipe here in a minute for the crisp topping that is vegan friendly. There are plenty of pumpkin pie recipes out there that are vegan friendly if you need to avoid the dairy. Most of them call for coconut milk, which again, you can't really taste coconut in coconut milk. You will taste the pumpkin. So that's an option for making a vegan pumpkin pie. And just look around for your favorite desserts. There pretty much anything that you would want to eat nowadays is available as a vegan recipe, either to buy in the store or to find online or in a cookbook. So here's the vegan fruit crisp topping if you want to make a fruit pie and make it vegan friendly. There are two options here depending on what you like. And the one that I made was with pecans, but you can even omit the nuts if those are an issue. You could substitute a different kind of nut, or you can just increase the oats if you'd prefer, and do instead 1.5 cups of oats and avoid the nuts completely. Or you can substitute seeds if you'd prefer, if there are people who can't eat nuts and that's an issue. And it's going to be a fairly thick and fairly sticky crisp topping, but it bakes nicely. You'll just put it on top of your unbaked pie and bake it according to the pie directions. If you need to, cover it for the last 10-15 minutes, but I didn't need to cover this. I baked it at 375 and I didn't need to cover it at all. It didn't get too dark. But if you have a pie recipe that calls for you to bake at a higher temperature than 375, then you might need to cover it. Or if you have to cook it a very long time, you might need to cover it for the last portion. This only cooked for about 40 minutes because it was small. So going beyond 40 minutes, you might need to cover it with foil. So hopefully there have been some ideas here that have helped you to think about finding vegetarian and vegan friendly options for your Thanksgiving meal. Bottom line is, don't get too frustrated about it. If you're a creative person who is looking for a chance to really explore, then great. There are plenty of recipes out there that can either help you to do a fairly traditional Thanksgiving meal that's vegan or vegetarian, and there are plenty of other recipes out there if you want to just go and do something different, like the lentil bowl with some vegetables and potatoes and things. Make sure you read your recipes and pay attention to what's in those recipes so that you know if there are ingredients that your guests can't eat, and then either find substitutions for those ingredients, put them on the side if you can, like with a Parmesan sprinkle, for example, or a gravy, or just find another recipe if you want. There are going to be vegan recipes out there for most of the dishes that we eat. And then pay attention to what's on those labels for the ready-made things that you buy in the store, whether it's straight from the deli or bakery or something prepackaged. Even those vegan cheeses, as I said, can contain traces of milk. So if that's an issue, you'll want to avoid them, but pay attention to what's there. And then try to find something that's a solid protein other than meat for your vegetarians and vegans. Even if you just open a can of baked beans for them, that's something. Or you can make your own homemade baked beans, make them ahead, or put them in the slow cooker to cook that day. There are lots of options. So thanks for checking out this video, and I hope that you have a safe and happy Thanksgiving, however you celebrate it.